Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is part 2 of my talks on Dharma. Part 1 was about the difference between what's called real Dharma and the formulated Dharma, or the Dharma of scriptures that we find in our various forms of Buddhism. In the first talk, I focused mainly on the real Dharma and its 3 components of right conduct, meditation, and wisdom. So today we go on to the formulated Dharma, Buddhism. Today in our world we have the living traditions of Buddhism: Theravada Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism. That's all we have. They don't all agree on the deeper points about quite what it was the Buddha achieved, about the content of his teaching, and what he intended for us. There is tremendous overlap on karma, cause and effect, on Buddhist ethics and morality, on the process of meditation, but it's on those really interesting, deeper points, fundamental points, that they don't agree. It becomes very hard to answer this question, then: who was the Buddha and what did he teach? And we'd all, I'm sure, love to go back in time with a time machine to really check it out. But that will never happen. And it will be nothing short of a miracle if archaeologists uncovered some living testimony from the time of the Buddha. But even then, that wouldn't be that much help, because I've seen in my very lucky life, working so closely with some of the most famous Tibetan masters, that for even one of those, if somebody said, "What did he teach?" you would be in a very difficult situation to answer that, because they teach different things to different people. Some people's experience is very extraordinary. They are much more advanced than others. They receive very personal, powerful teachings that other people never even hear. They don't even know they exist. And then in public, certain teachings are given at certain times to some people. And there are very few people who are with a teacher from beginning to end to really know all that they've done. So with the life of the Buddha, although our human mind would love a simplistic answer, 1, 2, 3, 4, ABC, he taught this, he did that, full stop, it is much more of a mystery. I think this is terrific, because it throws us back on ourselves rather than digesting some pre-formulated religion or dogma. Buddha Dharma should really get us asking questions, not just eating answers, asking questions and seeking ourselves the real answers to those questions. That's the nature of Dharma. Good Dharma practice, although it depends on teachers, is about awakening our own mind and curiosity. So then we have to look briefly at Buddhist history, or the development of those forms of Buddhism. We have 2 main areas that we call the Shravaka, or some people call it Hinayana Buddhism, present today mainly in the Theravada system in many, many countries. And we have the Mahayana schools, such as Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. A short talk such as this is not the place to go into the comparative philosophies and the comparison of the practices of the Shravaka way and the Mahayana way. It's simply to point out that they exist. And also perhaps to mention the amazing discoveries that happened in the 1990s. Because until then, there was a general assumption, at least in academic fields, that the Pali Canon, which is the basis for Theravada Buddhism, or the Shravaka way, was two things. First, that it was the oldest Buddhist literature, and second, that it represented what's called the original canon, a sort of original core teaching that developed into the various Buddhist ways, developed into the Mahayana, developed into the Vajrayana, and so on. In 1994, I think it was, some old birch bark manuscripts were discovered in Afghanistan. And as a result of those, research was done and many more were found. Dry, rolled up pieces of bark from a birch tree with writing in the Gandhara or Kharoshthi script. Some 200 different texts have been found so far. These are nearly all copies of older texts that probably came from central India. Because of those finds and the research done linguistically, we now know two things. The Pali texts were not the oldest. These texts are older. In fact, the oldest Pali text we have, manuscript, goes back only to the 16th century. In those tropical countries, texts, anything made of organic material, perished very quickly. The oldest Pali writing we have is written on gold sheets in a stupa in Burma, and it goes back to the 6th century. So although the Pali tradition says the first Pali text was written in about 50 BC, archaeologically we don't have any remains from anything like that time, whereas these texts found in Afghanistan actually come from the 1st century BC through to the 2nd century of our era, and they are copies from texts that must have been older, from Sanskrit texts. So first of all, the Pali canon was not the oldest, but more importantly, it was not an original canon. The idea, the thinking now, is that there wasn't one original teaching in the first 4 or 5 centuries after the Buddha where nothing was written down. But there were already parallel lines of teaching that gave rise to the different schools. No one original core material, but the great teacher who was the Buddha, teaching people on all sorts of levels, and those teachings gradually concretizing in our world as the various streams of Dharma. And of course, every Buddhist tradition traces its roots back to the Buddha. We all feel in Tibet and everywhere that what we have comes from the Buddha's enlightenment. I'd like to conclude this part 2 on a different note about the need for a path. Earlier on in this talk, I said that Dharma, what is Dharma? Dharma is a path we follow. A path, by its very nature, defines itself from and distinguishes itself from other paths. So then you will be a Buddhist following a Buddhist path as opposed to a Christian following a Christian path. You'll be following Tibetan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, and even within that you'll be following one particular type. Some people don't like this. They say it's narrow, it's exclusive. They want to keep the big universal picture. And there's a problem here, a very practical problem. It would seem from all of our experience, the experience of our great teachers in Buddhism and in other religions, from my own experience, from the experience of my teachers, that it is the people who follow with dedication, assiduously, putting all their heart into it, one path. These are the ones that really end up shining as human beings, filled with qualities. Unfortunately, very often those who try to keep the broad mind, keep all the options open, to learn from everything, they're often very nice people, but sometimes nothing much changes. They're the same nice person 30 years later as they were 30 years before, but they still haven't done that inner work that all our spiritual paths lead to, where you have to face your own emotions, your own thoughts, your own confusion, the complexity of your mind. And you have to use tools of contemplation, prayer, meditation, stillness, wisdom, so many things, in order to make some strength, some liberation, some freedom out of all of that. In my own life, I have met people who are Christian mystics, Sufi mystics, Buddhist mystics. They all have that same sparkle in the eye, that same peace and composure, that same insight into human nature, the same gentility, the same kindness towards other human beings. Something very special, by following their own paths. So commitment to a path and following a path is very important. And the great master Padmasambhava gave us such a simple teaching. He said, keep your mind as broad as space, which means to respect all the different ways, all the different paths. Keep your mind as broad as space. But make your action, your own, what you do, as fine as flour. Flour which is so fine once it's ground. Not loose and woolly, not procrastinating left until tomorrow, but days filled with that no good thing is too small not to do, where no harmful thing is so small that you can just do it and it doesn't matter. Dedication to one path, intensely, but at the same time staying broad-minded. That's what seems to work. I think that concludes this part 2, so as not to make it too long. There's probably something to be said in a part 3, so I'll see you there, maybe. Thank you very much for listening anyway. I hope that with the passing aeroplanes and chainsaws outside, you manage to hear. Anyway, have a lovely day and thank you.